Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. It's Tuesday, April 8th, 2025, episode 356, Make Love, Not War. Well, I wasn't old enough to be a hippie back in the 60s. I was only, uh, let's see, I was born in the 60s, and so way too young to really participate in that hippie era. But I did see a lot of hippies, and I remember that I really didn't like the appearance of hippies. They always kind of looked dirty. Uh, yeah, and I just really didn't like the lifestyle. So I looked up what is a hippie, and on Wikipedia, basically it describes it as a counterculture youth movement. I'll read some portions from the wiki. From hipster, right? So hippie comes from the word hipster, describing beatniks. And they were members of a social movement in the mid 20th century who subscribed to an anti-materialistic lifestyle. They rejected conformity and consumerism of mainstream American culture and expressed themselves through various forms of art, such as literature, poetry, music, and painting. They also experimented with spirituality, drugs, sexuality, and travel. The term beatnik was coined by San Francisco Chronicle columnist Herb Caen in 1958 as a derogatory label for the followers of the Beat Generation, a group of influential writers and artists who emerged during the era of the silent generation's maturing. From as early as 1946 to as late as 1963, but the subculture was at its most prevalent in the 1950s. That would be the beatniks. This lifestyle of anti-consumerism may have been influenced by their generation living in extreme poverty in the Great Depression. During their formative years, seeing slightly older people serve in World War II and being influenced by the rise of left-wing politics and the spread of communism. The name was inspired by the Russian suffix "nik," which was used to denote members of various political and social groups. The term beat was originally used by Jack Kerouac in 1948 to describe his social circle of friends and fellow writers. Okay, so I added some details so you know hippie comes from the whole beatnik things, counterculture. Then in Britannica, hippie lifestyle, hippies were largely a white middle class group of teenagers and 20 somethings. I emphasize white because it'll be significant in a little bit, who belonged to what demographers call the baby boom generation. They felt alienated from middle class society, which they saw as dominated by materialism and repression. Hippies developed their own distinctive lifestyle whereby they constructed a sense of marginality. They experimented with communal or cooperative living arrangements, and they often adopted vegetarian diets based on unprocessed foods and practiced holistic medicines. Hippies were also known for their unique style, favoring long hair and casual, often unconventional dress, sometimes in psychedelic colors, and that would be the tie-dyed shirts and clothing. Many males grew beards, and both women and men wore sandals and beads. Long flowing so-called granny dresses, now I know what they're called, were popular with the women, and rimless granny glasses with both men and women. For many, the Whole Earth catalog, which first appeared in 1968, became a source for the necessities of life. And I added up to that point because in college I lived in the Whole Earth house, right? That was the student housing that I lived in. And I always wondered, where did that come from? And I never bothered to look it up. We didn't have internet back in the day. People tried to explain it to me, some kind of environmental thing, but whatever. I go on with the Britannica's entry. Hippies tended to be dropouts from society, foregoing regular jobs and careers, although some developed small businesses that catered to other hippies. Many critics noted that hippies had the luxury of being able to check out of society and remarked on the incongruity of hippies participation in the civil rights movement, wherein Black Americans were fighting for the right to fully participate in society, right? But the hippies were doing something totally opposite. Hippies advocated nonviolence and love, a popular phrase being make love, not war, for which they were sometimes called flower children. They promoted openness and tolerance as alternatives to the restrictions and regimentation they saw in middle-class society. Hippies often practiced open sexual relationships and lived in various types of family groups. They commonly sought spiritual guidance from sources outside Judeo-Christian tradition, particularly Buddhism, Hinduism, and other Eastern religions, and sometimes in various combinations. And that's because Asian immigration picked up in the 1960s, and so now they had access to these previously not widely known religions. I go on. Astrology was also popular, and the period was often referred to as the Age of Aquarius. Public gatherings, part music festivals, sometimes protests, often simply excuses for celebrations of life, were an important part of the hippie movement. The first be-in, called the Gatherings of the Tribes, was held in San Francisco in 1967. It initiated this Summer of Love, wherein up to 100,000 members of the counterculture traveled across the United States and converged in the Haight-Ashbury district of that city. Many came for the Monterey International Pop Festival, but others were drawn to the utopian promises of peace and love. The situation, however, eventually devolved into chaos, of course. The district succumbed to overcrowding, crime. Free love was often used to condone rape and unsanitary conditions. In October 1967, a mock funeral called the Death of the Hippie Ceremony was held by a few of those that remained in San Francisco. InspirationFeed.com says hippies are people who reject mainstream norms and values and promote peace, love, and freedom. And on that website, they equate that with the woke culture of today. Of course, the problem with equating that is if the woke, as we saw during the Biden administration, basically held all the cards, all the political power, they're not counterculture. Okay, so it's not about freedom at all. Uh, the woke part of society does not promote freedom, right? It doesn't do that. But a lot of people will somehow make the mistake of saying, well, since it's out of step with traditional square members of society, then that would be consistent with what is hippie. So that's that. And what's interesting is that the hippie movement, we'll call it, um, on the one hand, was all about freedom. They wanted to explore new ideas, but was tied to communism, which is why there was a big agrarian movement, right? Get back to the land, do farming, all this other kind of stuff. And so that communist aspect of it is part of the contradiction of what the hippie movement was. I mean, you see the contradiction also in their participation with civil rights, right, where they're trying to, you know, be accepted into mainstream society, whereas the hippies were counterculture, right? They were checking out of society, all that materialism, right? So if you want to boil down, which is what I do, I want to know what is the core aspect, very Socrates like, right? The very much like Socrates dialogues. But what is that core idea of what makes a hippie a hippie? Is it long hair? Is it wearing beads? Is it, doing drugs? Being promiscuous? I mean, what is that core aspect of being a hippie? And it has to be freedom, right? If you emphasize freedom, well, then anything goes, right? If you want to do drugs or if you want to be promiscuous, right? Or if you want to be, avoid drugs, avoid, um, these sort of outdoor music fest type situation, sure, that's fine, right? And so promoting freedom leads to peace and love, all the things above, all those other things that people normally associate with hippies. Yeah, sure, that can be part of what is hippie. But if you choose to do or not do one, some, or all of those things, but you still are going to prioritize freedom, yeah, I think that qualifies you to be called a hippie still. In other words, if you start to police this idea of hippie, of saying, oh, no, 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 that's not what hippie is. See, you cease to be a hippie, right? Because you're then saying, no, there is some sort of form or structure in what a hippie is supposed to be, right? And obviously, there always was, right? If you're very straight-laced, didn't have fun, didn't do all the things that hippies did, then you were a square. Maybe you were a Herbert, right? I don't even know if they actually use the word Herbert. I saw it in a Star Trek episode, and so I figure maybe people were calling people Herbert. Anyway, maybe it was a reference to Herbert Hoover. Not sure. Anyway, uh, so once you start imposing a certain standard of what a hippie is and is not, well, I think technically speaking, you cease to be a hippie, right? Because to be a hippie is to be all about freedom. And that's the problem of the 60s hippie movement is that they thought that freedom could be exploited or preserved with communism. But what most people who are listening to me right now already know, communism is authoritarianism, right? You get a bunch of people who like to think that they all believe in the same things, but then there are a small group of people, there is a small group of people or several people who basically control everybody else, right? They are the leaders. They are authoritarian and they impose their will on everyone. Everyone must conform. And the fact that they emphasize an agrarian lifestyle, right? So they try to live in suburban, rural areas for their communes. It basically is an advocacy of poverty, which is what communism also does, right? And so what they think is sort of the utopia is actually just simply poverty, right? So you're going to turn away from all the modern conveniences, all the tools, the technology. Yeah, so basically you want to go back to poverty, right? Subsistence living, be on the, uh, have the threat of starvation if you didn't do your farming right, or if there's a drought or any of these things. And so basically it's an advocacy towards poverty, which is not a hippie in the true sense of freedom. So lots of people, why do I keep belaboring that point? Well, because there are a lot of people today who had parents who were hippies, right? So my kids right now, they're in college where I used to teach, right? Because I was hoping I'd get tuition remission. But anyway, so they're still there and they tell me about how people who I used to teach with are teaching the classes that I used to teach. And it's just really interesting, right? Because I have it's like getting inside information. Uh, but they'll sort of say that their parents were hippies or their grandparents were hippies and still are hippies, right? And sort of like it's a badge of you know uh credit, right? Like I know what hippies are really like. They raised me like that. Uh, you know, and so perhaps they want to share that to show that they also are counterculture. So anything that they do is counterculture. And so if people disagree with them about anything, then they are traditional, straight-laced, no fun squares or Herberts, right? And at that point, that's when you realize they forgot that the hippie movement is about freedom, right? And so a lot of people, and even one of my middle school students right now, they said today, I forget what the context was, but they said that their grandmother was one of their older relatives was a hippie. and still is, but is very aggressive, right? There's nothing about her, that relative, which is chill, which is laid back, which is like, you know, it's like odd. If you ever watch the movie, Clint Eastwood movie, Kelly's Heroes, there's basically they had a tank commander. His name was Oddball, played by Donald Sutherland. And he would always say, "Oh, look at all these negative waves. Stop it with the negative waves," right? And I guess the assumption in it is that he's always high. And so that's the thing, right? It's so they're not laid back anymore, right? The hippies of today who were hippies back in the 60s are not laid back. They are not relaxing and just telling everyone else to chill out. No, they have become the squares. It's interesting, right? Because the problem is that they haven't figured out, or they never figured out, that it's freedom, which is the core, which is what made them hippies. And so, which is why now they're actually pushing and imposing and oppressing, right? Doing all of the things that they were protesting against in the 1960s. They are those people today. Pro-war, right? A lot of these people, self-proclaimed hippies, they're pro-war. Oh, rah, 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 Ukraine, rah, 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 Israel. It's bizarre, right? So they were all about peace and love, right? And freedom back in the 60s, but now it's war, war, war. We got to kill all those people. So I would make the argument that the people who always prioritize freedom, they're the hippies, right? And so every once in a while, when I was teaching down at university, I would say, "How did I become the hippie?" Right? So we would talk about things that were going on in society, and then I would always come back to freedom. And then at one point in the conversation, right, there was that sudden realization that me, who is as straight-laced, I mean, I have like a kind of, usually when I get a haircut, I get a crew cut. I don't wear beads, I don't wear tie-dyed shirts, my jeans don't have holes in them. I'm so not your typical hippie. I don't do drugs, right? I'm not promiscuous, right? Obviously, as a pastor, right? So I'm not any of the things that stereotypically are associated with hippies, but when you listen to me, right, I speak the message of freedom. Whereas all of the opponents, right, who would like to call me a fascist, they're the ones who need everyone to conform, right? It's that communistic, hostile, hypocritical, contradictory attitude, which they hold on to and kind of mistakenly believe is the hippie attitude, right? It's why liberals believe they're still liberals. It's why perhaps probably a lot of people on the left, Democrats, still believe that they are uh, sort of in the right, that they're promoting social issues when in reality they are not. Now, people who prioritize freedom, they have to take care about their choices because they are responsible for their actions. And so when you prioritize freedom, there's accountability, there is responsibility. And so therefore, people who live with freedom are always seeking what is good, what is productive, eschewing and turning away from and getting rid of everything that is destructive and a waste, especially war, right? A true hippie is anti-war. And the only war that I would legitimize and say is legitimate is when the United States is invaded. All right. And so you have to defend yourself, but it's not going to happen anytime soon. Not with the countries as they exist today. You won't see that kind of invasion, right? So, because of that, the United States should be promoting peace, not war, like we're seeing today, which is so frustrating and maddening to witness. So people, everyone, must overcome their own biases, right? For example, what other people do with their freedom, right? So for example, what do I do with my freedom? I'm a Jesus freak. That's what I do with my freedom, right? People can't look at me and say, oh, you're using your freedom wrong. Eh, you lose your hippie status, right? To be free means you live in the way that you want. You take responsibility for the choices that you make, and you pay for your choices. And if you can't afford those choices, I don't care how good you think those choices are. If you cannot afford them, then you have to put yourself in a position where you can. And so living with freedom means that you're able to live the way you want, with who you want, where you want. And this is the way it should be. This is how we have peace. This is how we have prosperity, right? This is how we have love. So spread the word. Hippies are pro-freedom, which leads to love and peace. That's it for today. I had to have a more upbeat episode after yesterday's rant. So hopefully that did the trick. And hope you had. I'll talk to you guys next time.